This is Vandana Purkyastha. I'm the Vice President for International Sociological Association, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri, who is the President of Indian Sociological Society. Professor Chaudhuri is an eminent sociologist known around the world for her work, especially on the sociologies of gender and sociologies of media. Today, she will talk to us about sociology in India. Over to you, Professor Chaudhuri.
Thank you so much, Professor Vandana Purkyastha. Welcome, everyone. In this episode of the very exciting series of podcasts that has been initiated by the International Sociological Association as part of ongoing efforts to enhance collective understanding of sociologies from various parts of the world, I will be trying to give a broad overview of sociology in India. The task is not easy. One is the scale of India itself is a challenge, and further, sociology in India emerged and developed very differently in various parts of India. There were certain broad similarities, but also important differences. What I shall present will therefore be both partial and thin. India has also witnessed in the last decades the growth of very fine body of scholarship on disciplinary histories. For instance, Sujata Patel's work, an edited volume titled Anthropology in the East by Patricia Oberoi, Satish Deshpande, Nandini Sundar. Now here, even if you look at the title, Anthropology in the East, it perhaps flags off certain kind of contradictions in the manner in which sociology of India has been practiced. We've had a kind of very different relationship with social anthropology in our parts as compared to perhaps the story of social anthropology and sociology in the West. Indeed, most sociologists in India have mentioned that when they travel to the West, they would be introduced as anthropologists and would probably have closer relationships with the Department of Anthropology. Globally, however, perhaps developments both within sociology and anthropology have reconfigured this relationship. I would try to map the story of sociology in India within a certain framework of broader history of ideas that itself is embedded in the story of India's successive encounters with, number one, colonialism, number two, developmental state, number three, the neoliberal market and globalization, and number four, the more contemporary rise of majoritarian authoritarianism. Many of the issues and themes and concerns which emerged during colonialism overlaps through all the four periods, acquiring certain stridency at particular specific points of time, and sometimes they acquire new avatars. This division, therefore, for me, is just to facilitate my presentation. I would start with some very broad dates and certain places. 1990, sociology department began in Bombay University, and in 1921 in Lucknow. But in Lucknow, it was called the Department of Economics and Sociology. In 1928 in Mysore, where it was called Sociology and Anthropology. In 1917, it was started as a subject in Calcutta University, but it did not develop into a full program. And anthropology was the more, important department till the 70s when sociology emerged in Calcutta. In Mysore, it was in 1928. In Osmania, in 1928. Now, when I give you these broad names, there are important differences. One being Calcutta, Bombay, Madras were part of British administrative rule. Osmania was not, nor was Mysore. Now, this is important when we talk about colonialism because parts of the country were directly under the British. And the first three universities were in the British presidencies of Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay. Whereas you also had very important higher educational initiatives in the non-British areas. So the storyline may be very different. I cannot go into details here, but I think it's important to flag that off. Now, one of the issues, which was something which bothered a lot of the early sociologists, including the time when I was studying in the late 1970s, is the idea that the colonial rulers were very keen to project India as not suitable to be an independent sovereign nation. That they were divided by caste, religion, ethnicities, tribes. They were less than civilized, in other words, and were not fit to be a modern national sovereign state. Indian anthropologists and sociologists were aware of the contradictions and divisions within India, but perhaps this nationalist urge led to a certain kind of blurring of these various divisions. Something which was critiqued much later, that gender, caste, tribe was sort of not given due attention. The other thing, which was a central theme in the colonial period, in the period after independence, and persists today, in fact, acquiring a certain stridency in the contemporary period, is the centrality of the unique nature of India's culture. In a sense, it began during colonialism, against British colonialism, trying to argue that, look, we are an ancient civilization, we have a long, uninterrupted history, living history, we have texts which matter. A certain kind of assertion of pride of the indigenous. And in that, there were two kinds. And I was looking at other South Asian countries where here in the Indian context, there was a celebration of the ancient Indian culture. But likewise, in countries where Hinduism was not the majority religion, there was a celebration of a pure, very proud Islamic past. So this is a kind of theme which plays out continuously through the period. That in turn led to two kinds of tendencies. If you read the writings in the 1960s, post-independence, there would be writings by Professor J.P.S. Oberoi, who talks about Swaraj and science, and the fact that colonial categories have to be got rid of. But this was no blind, fundamentalist kind. They were very theoretically suave, and they were trying to engage with how do we look at these categories? At another place in Lucknow, much before Professor Oberoi's writings, you had, say, A.K. Saran, who would be having a certain problem with the very nature of sociology and the specificity of India, which would require its own categories. This is interesting in the context of the whole buzz about decolonialism in the current context. And Deepu Mukherjee, for instance, writes about the individual. And that the individual, which is a very important category in modern Western sociology, is not quite adequate to talk about the relational aspect of personhood, or what he calls Vyakti, in the Indian context. So this is a theme which is a running theme right till now, where you have, of course, a different kind of issue. Post-colonialism, when you became independent, there was another tension which grew up. It was not just about categories, but what role should sociology play? What kind of role should it play in policy making? What kind of data should they provide? How could they help in nation building? And nation building was a category which we used as when we were students, lots of seminars on nation building. Along with comes the modernization model. Because what we have is a freshly independent, but also a global stage, Cold War, and the coming in of the American sociology, model of modernization, and with structural functionalism, became a very predominant influence in India. And structural functionalism became, in a certain sense, what sociology in India was about. So on one hand, you would have claims for indigenous categories. On the other hand, you had, structural functions. People like A.R. Desai, who was one of the few Marxist sociologists, they were sort of on the margins in Indian sociology. Unlike economics and history in Indian sociology, Marxist ideas were not very dominant. In fact, there was a certain kind of discomfort with Marxism in Indian sociology. So you had, say, Professor S.C. Dubey, who was very, very committed to the idea of nation building, state building, and there were debates elsewhere, say in Delhi School, about pure applied sociology. So there was, say, Professor M. N. Srinivas not very happy with the idea of applied sociology and the idea that you would have to have pure academics. So you would have similar kind of strands in different parts of the country. In JNU, where I was trained, which came about much later in the 70s, it was a different historical period. And there was a certain kind of going back to constitutional visions of secularism, growth with equity, development, attention to marginalized section, etc. And the syllabus, in a certain sense, reflected that. Within Indian sociology, there were people who felt this was not really proper sociology. Proper sociology would have to look at certain kind of texts, usually sociology from the North. And this kind of sociology was sort of interdisciplinary, and people were not very comfortable with this. Now, after that, say in the late 1980s or from the late 1970s, in the Indian context, there was a certain kind of unease, the kind of objectives that the Indian state after independence was supposed to offer didn't quite happen. You had a lot of movements, labor movements, women movements, peasants movement, civil rights movement, which took place from the end of 1970s onwards. And there was a rethinking within sociology, as well as direct impact on the kind of sociology which was being done. Early 1980s, sociologists like Kamala Ganesh started writing, say, on the institution of family and household, and how the household was a very different kind of category in India as a site not just for consumption, which would be true in a modern, Western society, but also a site of production. And there are very interesting debates. But given the global intellectual unevenness of knowledge, that kind of writings did not acquire the global salience that they ought to have. And this is something I would like to flag off, even when it comes later, say Sharmila Rege's work on caste and gender, the entire anti-caste movement, the Dalit movement, Ambedkarites, talking about the reproduction of caste and gender being simultaneous, we did not use the word intersectionality. And even here, people would talk about Crenshaw and not talk about the writings which were right here, which was intersectional. If you go back to Tarabai Shinde's Triburush Tulana, it is about land, it's about class, caste, feudalism, capitalism, and patriarchy and patrilineality and the double standards of patriarchy, So this is something that I think maybe we were not confident enough to say that, look, we also theorize, because what was being argued in our part, that Indian sociologists do not have any independent theory. And they had a certain understanding of theory, which is primarily generalization. That if you have certain cases which work out and then you generalize and you put forward a supposition. All that got a little more muddled from the 1990s. 1990s, globally, people were talking about globalization. And like text traveled to our parts, Appadurai's work traveled to our parts, it became a textbook. But the 1990s in India, particularly for the country and for sociology, were very central because you had the Babri Masjid demolition, you had the Ramayodhya movement, and you had the Mandal Commission. But what scholars like Satish Deshpande have argued that Indian sociology, who for so long was so obsessed with questions of caste and religion, seemed to have very little to speak on what were the implications of the Mandal Commission or what was the implications of a surgence of Hindu righthood. But from the 90s, you have a lot of scholarship which emerges, feminist scholarship, as well as Dalit scholarship, a critical scholarship which started questioning the very categories that we have used, including categories like modernization, that we would just sort of apply it and work it out. So the 90s for us was a point which was very, very different, and you had interesting pieces. But like the story in colonialism, or the caveat that I began with, that the scale of India and the regions are very different. So in some parts, you would have a mechanical reproduction of the globalization debates which took place in the global north, like hybridization, everything was a fusion, the bounded entities were getting, and people would repeat that. As a teacher, I would look at the text and they would be repeating these kind of things. But on the other hand, if you look at the public media, debates were on privatization, loss of jobs, the surrender of India's sovereignty, very different kinds. And sociology somehow did not respond to it in the same way they could have. And one of the reasons I personally feel is the older model of seeing culture as being the central defining element of Indian society and Indian culture. So the main critique about globalization that we will lose our culture, rather than maybe we will lose our jobs. And we can see the transformation in higher education since then, quite dramatic, which has taken place in our country. So, the story is mixed. If you look at the colonial period, developmental stage, and after that you have what happens with globalization, and much now in the contemporary period, where, you could sort of ask, what is it which is so mixed up and complex in the contemporary period? So if you look at the current period, I can see many of these trends which I have identified still present, but acquiring new forms and new mutations, so to say. One is the idea of culture. That our culture is unique. This is what distinguishes us. You also have a shift from an earlier form of nationalism during the colonial period, which was about justice, equity, constitutional vision, etc., to a triumphant nationalism. It's a triumphant nationalism. Look, we are better than you. Our culture is better, our language is better, our histories are better. Along with that, you have the kind of conjoining with neoliberalism, which is a kind of very, very powerful combination, because the entire diktat is that, look, sociologists and social scientists are always critical. They are negative. And what we expect from social science in the contemporary period is a positive narrative. In other words, like the media in our country, the academia too should be basically publicity, faces of the state and the market, so to say. Because in this triumphant nationalism, people are not looking at how the state and the market have been reconfigured. It's not a question of the retreat of the state, but the state and the nature of the market itself has changed. I would like to sort of end by, some of the issues which sort of confront us in the contemporary, that we have, India is an uneven country, it's unequal and it is diverse. Our academia is unequal and diverse. In the last 20 years, we have a whole new body of scholars who have been trained in the global north, who have sophisticated language in their hands, who are trained in the global north, and many of them have a sizable presence in high-end academia in our country. So even if you look at contributions to Indian sociology, and somebody actually did that study, that how many people who submit papers there are trained in the West. Now, I'm not talking about it from a provincial, triumphant nationalist position, but a position where knowledge and knowledge producers have a symbiotic relationship. So once you're located somewhere, you have a feel of the place. In the old anthropological sense, you're an observer, you're a participant observer, you see what is happening around you. And some of the categories which are used there may be relevant, some are definitely relevant, but some may not be or have to be tuned or fine-tuned. We are, on one hand, have this kind of glossy academia, and on the other hand, because of the expansion of higher education and massification of education, we also have a very sorry state of everyday practices where you have rote learning, guidebooks, the MCQ, which has become the dominant model, one-word answer in subjects like sociology, which is really open-ended and critical. So we are poised in different times, apart from, of course, the language question. How many people actually are proficient in English, which is the dominant language? How have we developed our Indian languages in the social sciences? So I think these are important questions. The NEP, the National Education Policy, talks about the mother tongue. But in India, very often, the mother tongue is not necessarily the language which is the medium of instruction in the region. So the language you speak at home may not be the language which is being taught as mother tongue in the school or college or university. So it's a complicated situation. But if we are in times where you're told that if you do any kind of critical study, you are in a certain sense not being very supportive to the country, then it becomes a certain death of sociology in a certain sense. So I think I would stop here.
Would you like to comment on anything else that is either a challenge to sociology or a particular contribution of sociology today?
Yeah, let me begin with contribution. The contribution of sociology, as you would be aware, that you have the declaration of the caste census. The fact that, there's a recognition that castes have to be counted and that it is legitimate is itself, I think, a complete contribution, I would say, not just politically, but academically. There have been sociologists who've been writing on this as public sociologists, not just in academics. I think the gender question, because a lot of feminist sociologists have been writing in academic journals, increasingly in public forums, about the gender question, violence against women, the idea of the family, marriage, kinship. We have some of the most exciting work on family, marriage and kinship. If you see Ravinder Kaur, Rajni Palriwala, Patricia Oberoi, they're very, very fine work which has taken place. Complex macro structures like migration, sex ratio, and what it does to ideas of malehood. So it's it is the best of sociology, looking at the macro and the micro. So there is a lot that sociologists have done. The challenge is the unevenness of it. The challenge is the kind of persistent idea, which I may not have touched earlier, that it's not a serious discipline like economics. It is common sense. It's something that everybody knows about. And the common sense in sociology, which was always a contested relationship, have got completely blurred today. Because people at the helm of power also speak common sense. So they give a certain legitimacy, which you can see in the judges adjudicating on questions of rape or marriage or live-in relationship, etc. So I think that is a huge challenge, because this was always a challenge, but today it's legitimate to say it is common sense. It is our society, it is our culture, and sociology have to represent it as it is. In a certain sense, yes, sociology is supposed to say what is and not what ought to be, but what is in a mechanical sense, not in any analytical sense, and why do we have patrilineality, or what is its relationship with land ownership or law. Not in that sense, but in the sense that this is how we are, and this is what should be represented. So I think that is a huge challenge. We also have private universities, some of them very competent, doing good work, but we have a certain abdication of the public universities, which happens here. So you again have an aggravation of the unequalness of education. So who teaches in which universities? Private universities, public. Within the private, some private universities more directly under the control of certain ideologies, some less. But public universities, which are directly for funding or any kind of resources under the state, it leads to another kind, apart from questions of access. So I think these are the two main challenges and contributions. Now, it depends on us which trajectory we take up.
Thank you. That was an absolutely fascinating journey for me, and I'm sure it's going to be for all of the listeners around the world, to hear about Indian sociology imagine the long arc of history and understand the kind of challenges and the contributions that sociology makes today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.